The Parkinson's podcast is brought to you by the Davis Phinney Foundation and brings you the stories, wisdom, and expertise of people living with Parkinson's, care partners, and Parkinson's professionals. In this episode of the Parkinson's podcast, Executive Director Polly Dawkins speaks with Dr. Ray Dorsey and Dr. Michael Okun about their forthcoming book, The Parkinson's Plan, A New Path to Prevention and Treatment, set for release on August 19, 2025. Framed around the acronym PLAN, Prevent, Learn, Amplify, Navigate, the book shares compelling stories from the Parkinson's community and outlines a bold roadmap toward prevention and proactive care. Listen in as the authors discuss what inspired them to write the book and the actions we can take now to help create a world without Parkinson's.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Polly Dawkins, Executive Director of the Davis Phinney Foundation, and I am thrilled to be joined today by two remarkable leaders in our community, the Parkinson's community, Dr. Ray Dorsey and Dr. Michael Okun. And they're going to be here to talk with us today about their new book, The Parkinson's Plan. Welcome, Ray and Michael.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having us, Polly. Delighted to be with you.
As I read through the book, it occurs to me and for our audience to know that this isn't just another book about Parkinson's. It's a call to action. It looks beyond the symptoms and into systems, the environment, exposures, and inequities that are driving Parkinson's. I also felt that it was a hopeful book, and one that points towards change. So I'm really excited to dig in with you. To start, I would like to know, as you open the book, you start with the stories of Sarah and Jana, both who are accomplished, both diagnosed in their 40s. Why was it important to the two of you to start there?
First of all, we're delighted to be with you. We're delighted to be with Davis Phinney. It's really hard to have Parkinson's disease. It's really hard to have Parkinson's and be the face of it. So anytime we have a chance to thank Davis Phinney or Brian Grant or Michael J. Fox or others, we're delighted to do so. These are the people who change the course of the disease. Diseases end, just like new diseases emerge and old diseases die away. And our goal for this book is for Parkinson's disease to die away. And that in the next 10 years that the rise of Parkinson's disease stops. And that means after 10 years, the fall of Parkinson's begins. And that's what our main goal is here. So we want to thank you and Davis Phinney for all of that. So Michael and his colleagues wrote a paper about changing the perception of Parkinson's disease. And it's mostly known as an old man's disease because when Dr. James Parkinson described it in 1817, he described old men with the disease. And Jana Reed and Sarah Winningham are young women with Parkinson's disease. Both are athletes, both served their country in the U.S. Air Force Academy, both went on to medical school, both served in Afghanistan, both are mothers to daughters, and both were diagnosed in their mid-40s within 1 month of one another. And we highlight them because they change the misperceptions around Parkinson's disease is that it's aging, that it's men, and that it's genetics. And for Sarah and Jana, one of them carries genetic risk factor, but largely it's young women getting it from environmental causes. And we think that's the number one cause of Parkinson's disease for the vast majority of people. And we wanted to change the dialogue and give people characters that are new to them and new to the Parkinson's community.
Well, thank you for that. Their stories are so powerful.
And they're powerful people, by the way, as you can imagine, physicians, athletes, U.S. Air Force Academies.
One of the things just to add is it's really important to us. And it's so nice that you got the sense of hopefulness. We need a plan, right? And we have to move Parkinson into being a community disease. When Ray and I and Todd Scherer and Bush and Bloom wrote the book Ending Parkinson's Disease, we talked about the PACT, the Prevent, Advocate, Care, and Treat. Here we talk about the plan, okay? And, the plan being prevent, learning why, amplifying voices, and navigating new treatments. When we dig and delve into diseases like HIV and diseases like cancer, we realize they are in the communities, right? We check blood levels for viral titers in HIV. We're following people with various cancers in various ways. We have care navigators for diabetes. we need to make this a community disease. And so I think maybe part of the hopefulness that you sensed when you were reading was our kind of real, intentional, deliberate desire to engage with experts all over the world to think about how this turns into a community disease and how we can get our plan together in multiple facets in order to move the needle.
Great. We'll get to the plan here shortly. Michael, you mentioned your previous book, one of your previous books, Ending Parkinson's Disease. Why was it the right time now to come out with a new book? And how has your thinking evolved since you and your co-authors wrote Ending Parkinson's Disease?
So with the Parkinson series of books, we're trying to create a continuum of thought for people. How does one end a disease like polio, like HIV, like cancer, right? And so we're talking about that a lot in Ending Parkinson's Disease, and then create this continuum, moving forward. And what is absolutely so important about what you just said is things change, right? And so when we wrote Ending Parkinson's Disease, and it turned out that when Ray Dorsey dug into those numbers and made those projections of explosive growth in 2035, there's going to be 12 million cases of Parkinson's disease. The world went crazy, right? People's heads turned around like owls, and they were like thinking, oh my God, how are we going to handle this? How is Medicare going to handle this? This is explosive growth. This is faster than the growth of Alzheimer's disease. Now we published this book coming out in the fall, and guess what? We're already at 11.8 million in 2025 based on numbers that are a few years old, and we had to base our last projections. So we are explosively growing. And so when I say to you, Polly, what gives here? Can't you just write one book and be done with it? No, we're not even started here. We need to create a movement beyond the idea that this is something that is going away. This is something that is explosively growing, and we need to have a plan for it.
Ray, you and I have chatted recently, and you've said Parkinson's is largely a man-made disease. Tell us a little bit about that, and what is the most sort of misunderstood piece of that statement?
So let's think what are man-made diseases. So this really smart epidemiologist, Abdul Omran, in 1971 was interested in population growth. And for most of human history, we've been around for about 200,000 years. Population has been relatively stable. We didn't get to like 1 billion people until like 1800 or 1900. So the vast majority of human history, we haven't grown very much, chiefly because we didn't have enough food initially. And then we had a lot of pandemics. We had influenza, we had smallpox, we had Black Plague, and many others. And then he says we now live in an era of degenerative and man-made diseases. And I'll give you a poster child for man-made disease, lung cancer. So lung cancer, leading cause of cancer death in the United States, leading cause of cancer death in the world. And in 1900, United States, it just largely did not exist. There was no lung cancer. It was so rare, it was considered a once-in-a-lifetime oddity. Students and doctors would gather around thinking they would never see another case. And it wasn't until the advent of cigarettes that we saw the rise of lung cancer. It wasn't until the advent of ultra-processed food and soft drinks that we saw the rise of type 2 diabetes. And wasn't until the advent of the car we saw motor vehicle accidents, which kill 100 people every day in the United States. And it wasn't until the advent of pesticides, industrial chemicals, and air pollution that we largely saw Parkinson's disease. Before Dr. Parkinson described the condition in 1817, Parkinson's was extraordinarily rare. There are only very, very few ancient descriptions of the disease. And now it's one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases. So when I see someone with Parkinson's, I get pissed off because I know the suffering that Parkinson's takes. I know the long journey that it's ahead for them, for their family, for their caregivers. And I think it's almost all of it's unnecessary. Bad things happen to people, but preventable bad things we should prevent. And Parkinson's disease is preventable. It's certain pesticides, dry cleaning chemicals. We're doing this so our clothes don't shrink. And air pollution are fueling the rise of Parkinson's disease.
Well, let's go back to the question about the Parkinson's plan. And I'd love for one of you to talk about this concept that you introduced of the Parkinson's 25. I love that concept because it seems to me as these are actions that all of us can take, 25 actions we can take.
Yeah, so Michael and I got asked a lot of times to give the talk and say it's preventable, so what should we do? And so I got tired of being asked that question. So I said, here it is. We give you 25 things that you can do to reduce your risk of Parkinson's disease. 25 actions almost everyone can do. First one is to wash your fruits and vegetables, including your organic ones, because exposure to pesticides increases your risk of Parkinson's. Our colleague, Dr. Brittany Krzyzanowski, just had a paper come out this week showing that living near a golf course doubles your risk of Parkinson's disease. And that's likely because of pesticides. So what can we do in our everyday lives to decrease our exposure to pesticides? And so we give you 25 things: water filters, air purifiers, thinking about where you live, avoiding certain dry cleaning chemicals, and the list goes on for 25. And these are ways to reduce your risk. And these are also likely ways to slow the rate of progression of Parkinson's disease. Boss Bloom and I were talking the other day, and he says maybe the reasons why some people have slowly progressive Parkinson's disease and some have fast is some people are still being exposed to the chemicals and others aren't. And so there are studies that link air pollution to higher rates of hospitalization among people with Parkinson's disease. So you know that by the time you get Parkinson's disease, 60% of the nerve cells that produce dopamine in the brain have died off. Well, what are we doing to protect the remaining 40%? We should be hypervigilant about not getting exposed to pesticides, hypervigilant about not getting exposed to dry cleaning chemicals, and hypervigilant about not getting exposed to air pollution. It's just like if a smoker comes in and gets diagnosed with lung cancer, we tell them to stop smoking. But if a farmer comes in with Parkinson's disease, do we tell them what pesticides are they using at home? Are we telling them to test their well water? Are we telling them to put an air purifier in their home? Are we telling them to use a respirator or gloves when they're farming? I mean, there are tons of things that we can do to lower your risk of ever getting Parkinson's, so you live a life free of Parkinson's, which should be the goal. And if you are unfortunate enough to already have the disease, what can you do to slow the rate of progression so you can live as full and as an active life as possible? If you want to live well today, here are 25 things you can do to live well today.
Thank you for highlighting that. I had never thought about the slow or faster progression might be attributed to more and more exposure. So you've got these 25 actions. Are they in order of importance? So for the number one, wash your fruit and vegetables, is that the number one most important, or are all 25 equally important?
So it follows the organization of the book, which talks about chemicals in our food, chemicals in our water, chemicals in our air, indoor and outdoor. And so the Parkinson's 25 follows that. Michael's very organized, and so he has a clear structure and a clear plan to everything that we come up with.
I was just going to say that the other thing just to remember about having a plan, and I always love to tell the story about my son who, when he was younger, he was like a national chess champion twice, and he was like in second and third grade. But when he was in first grade, he was beating me in chess, every night before bed. And I'm not a bad chess player. I used to play with my dad. And one night, the little first grader says to me, after he's about to beat me the third time before he goes to bed, he says, "Dad, do you know what your problem is?" And I said, "No, Jack, what's my problem?" And he said, "Your problem is you don't have a plan. I have a plan. I sit down and I'm able to beat you every single time. You sit down without a plan. You got to have a plan." And it really is very insightful, even from a first grader, about how, we forget how important it is to have a plan. And so the Parkinson 25 really helps people to focus back about the things they can do. But also the Parkinson plan in its construct also provides at least a roadmap. It doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, I'm not saying we have all the answers, right? But a roadmap for us to get on the road to having a societal plan, a larger plan, and then each one of us needs to have an individual plan. And so that might be some of the hope that you read, Polly, in the book.
You mentioned horizon. In the navigate section of your book, you spotlight treatments on the horizon. What gives either of you the most optimism or hope?
Yeah, so Ray and I had a lot of conversations about this. And as we were writing the book, it turns out that we split the last two chapters about navigation, that's the end, navigating and looking toward those horizons, into three categories. And we think of the near term, what we need to do now. We've got 12 million people now with Parkinson. We need symptomatic therapies for these people. We can't forget them along on our journey. We have to think about where we've made our, our errors in thinking and ways we can revise our thinking. So we interviewed a lot of scientists who went into the field, one who's now retiring, out of the field, and kind of what they are thinking before and thinking now. And I think that, brings us forward. And then thinking about the epics in the next 5 years, we're going to repurpose drugs. We're going to think about, how we can rethink the way that we're using, pump therapies, how we can cocktail combinations of therapies. And then as we move into that second horizon, maybe 6 to 10 years here, we're going to rethink regenerative medicine. Are there new targets we can look at, things that we're thinking about that might be important, like cognition, thinking, gait, walking, talking, those other things, and focus on are there things we can do now as we begin to open the door to the longer term horizons, thinking about gene editing, thinking about gene therapy, and could there be a longer term? And then, of course, nanoparticles and nanomedicine is something that's completely overlooked, but so important to the future, right? And you've got such advantages to being able to use this and do something I love to say, uncage, it's a cool word. We're uncool neurologists, so we say uncage. So you can put little teeny things into the brain or into the nervous system and uncage them with things like ultrasound, magnets, temperature, all sorts of cool things that are coming. So we got a chance to talk to a lot of these great scientists and just start to think about how we organize the horizons and then how we resource and fund them so we can move, the needle. And so I do think that's hopeful. But I think, one of the things as we talk to a lot of folks, and maybe this from Davis Phinney as well, when people get involved, they're immediately thinking of let's get to the cure and maybe skipping, along a little too. And we actually need to have a plan that includes the folks who have Parkinson now and creates that horizon so we can move along and then resource it along with proportional money, right, Ray, going to what? Prevention, right? Do we only spend 2 to 3 cents out of every dollar on prevention? That's got to change. We need a proportional investment into prevention.
Thank you. Ray, in your book, you propose a 0, 10, 100 goal by 2035. So 10 years from now. Can you briefly describe what that goal is?
Yeah, so we were motivated by the HIV community, which UNAIDS had a 90-90-90 goals. 90% of people with HIV will be diagnosed, 90% will be appropriately treated, and 90% will have suppression of the virus in their blood. And so Michael and I came up with the 0, 10, 100 goals for by 2035. So the next 10 years, the lifetime of hopefully the vast majority of the readers of the book, that there will be a 0% rise in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. By 2035, the world's fastest growing brain disease will no longer be the world's fastest growing brain disease because adjusted for age, the number of new cases will be flat. And there's actually precedence for that. We see that in Europe. We likely see signs of slowing of the incidence of Parkinson's disease in the Netherlands and in Germany. And I think that's because they cleaned up their environment. If we clean up our environment around the United States, if we stop polluting other parts of the world, I think we can see a 0% rise and then a fall. And then 10 is a 10x increase in research funding for Parkinson's disease and 10 times as much going into prevention. So right now, NIH spends in 2024 about $250 million on Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's, it turns out, affects about the same number of Americans as HIV. And actually, the number of new cases of Parkinson's disease is now rising faster than the number of new cases of HIV if you complete it, because we prevent HIV with a condom. But HIV receives 10 times as much federal funding as Parkinson's disease. So Michael said we need an Operation Warp Speed for Parkinson's disease. We need to do that by increasing the funding 10 times. And right now, only 2 cents of every Parkinson's research dollar goes to preventing the disease. We actually spend more. Some homes in Southern Florida and Southern California are sold for more money than we as society invest in trying to prevent Parkinson's. And so instead of 2 pennies out of every dollar going to preventing the disease, we think 2 dimes should go to do so. And the last one, Michael's probably greatest passion or his favorite goal, is getting 100% of people with Parkinson's disease access to levodopa. Parkinson's disease is a highly treatable disease. It's been so for 50 years. Treatments are imperfect. They have side effects and the like. But 90% of people with HIV are getting appropriate treatment for their condition. And that's with expensive, sometimes unsafe medications. Why aren't 100% of people with Parkinson's disease getting access to safe, inexpensive, low-cost medications that's in a pill? Why are some people with Parkinson's disease not getting appropriate treatment? We find it unacceptable for people with HIV to not get treatment. I think we find it unacceptable for people to have seizures when we have medicines to prevent seizures. I think we should find it unacceptable that people with Parkinson's disease are going without. very inexpensive, highly effective medications.
I love that. So for our listeners who hear this goal and are inspired, what's one action they could take away today to support that vision?
We give you 25 things you can do to lower your risk of getting Parkinson's disease, because we kept getting asked that question. So we give you 25 things that you can do as an individual. Then we tell you what you can do in the community. So I think one thing that we should think about as a community is getting rid of pesticides in schools. It turned out I learned that pesticides are sprayed on kids' schools and playground. And pesticides, as many of your listeners know, are nerve toxins. And it's not terribly surprising that many of these pesticides, as we saw from this study on golf courses, are linked to Parkinson's disease. They're linked to intellectual disabilities. They're linked to autism. There are 3 studies from 3 different countries linking pesticide exposure or leaking soccer playing to ALS. And so I think pesticides are playing a role on that. So I think in our communities, we can say, hey, schools are using pesticides. Why are we using it? Why can't we get rid of it? In California, you can't use certain toxic pesticides, and schools must notify parents in writing before they use pesticides on their playgrounds. We should do the same thing for our schools. We do the same thing for our golf courses. And then we highlight what are societal actions that we can do to prevent Parkinson's. There's a chemical called trichloroethylene perchloroethylene, which is likely responsible for the basketball player Brian Grant having Parkinson's disease. EPA banned it in 2024. That ban has been frozen by the current administration. People should tell their representatives, especially in red districts, to let that ban stay. No action needs to be taken by Congress. They can just say, let the ban stay. And so that future generations are spared Parkinson's disease. And this chemical is also known to cause cancer, and it's been doing so for 100 years. So if we want to stop cancer as well, we should just ban these dry cleaning and degreasing chemicals.
Great. Thanks for those. In your introduction to the book, you write, "We have failed enough and we have seen enough. Most Parkinson's is preventable and it must end." That's such a powerful statement. It's urgent and deeply human. How did you feel when one of you wrote those words? And what do you hope that readers take from that moment in the book?
Can I start, Michael, and then you go?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the metric of success for Michael and me? I think it's the number of people with Parkinson's disease. We're smart guys, and on our watch, Parkinson's disease has become the fastest growing brain disease. And then who's responsible for that? And I think fundamentally, Michael and I are responsible for that, and our colleagues. Our peers in HIV have answered the bell there. Our peers in COVID-19 answered the bell there. Our colleagues in stroke have largely answered the bell, but we have failed to answer the bell. Parkinson's disease on our watch, despite the efforts of David Phinney, despite the efforts of Brian Grant, despite the efforts of Michael J. Fox, has increased in its prevalence. Michael likes to say, I think every 6 minutes, someone's diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in the US, and every 12 minutes, someone's dying from Parkinson's disease in the United States. I think these are all signs that we have failed to answer the bell, answer the call, and that people are suffering needlessly with a preventable disease. And the sooner we get around to preventing the disease, the sooner we get around to alleviating the suffering. Almost everyone who has Parkinson's disease agrees that Parkinson's disease sucks. And so we need to prevent people from getting it. And we lay out a very detailed plan for how to do that as individuals, as communities, as societies, so that when you walk the streets of New York City or in Colorado or go to the airport, you just don't see any more Parkinson's disease. It's unnatural. Parkinson's disease is an unnatural consequence of aging, and we need to get rid of this artificial man-made disease.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we chose those words carefully. It wasn't like we said, oh, we're going to go out and, and try to gaslight and write it. No, like we looked at the data. And, we were just blown back, Polly. I mean, it's just, it's beyond what we should consider to be acceptable. And honestly, when we look at other diseases have done a better job in advocacy. And I'm not saying that any of us are bad advocates. Look, you and I and Ray have been at this for multiple decades, and we're going to be at it, every day of our life. When we choose those words, it's very, very deeply personal. And that we don't believe that we're doing enough. And we believe we have the data that suggests that we need to, be shaken up a little bit and wake up. And so we're really hoping that the Parkinson plan, provides, here's 2 of us that have been doing science our whole careers, We're not crazy zealots of some variety. We're centered, on data and science, and we're really worried, and we wanted to express that worry to people. And that's another reason that we wrote this book.
Yeah, I would reflect that you're centered on data and science. And to me, you're both deeply human. Like, you're centered on people and the people you care for and that we care about. So thank you for that, for both of you.
The book is filled with stories. The book isn't filled with studies. The studies are in the background, but the book is filled with stories like Brian Graham, like Sarah Whittingham, like Jenna Reed. And we want to thank all of them for entrusting their stories to us. The vast majority of people did not seek to be anonymized, and they shared their stories. And I said at the outset, it's hard to have a disease like Parkinson's, but it's hard to be the face of that disease. And we want to thank those individuals for entrusting their stories to us.
Absolutely. The acronym PLAN, the Parkinson's 25, the 0, 10, 100 goal. We've talked about those topics. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you really want our listeners to walk away with, in addition to how they get a copy of this book?
I really want people to appreciate that if you go into a community, any given community, any family on this planet, you're going to encounter Parkinson, and it's growing. Okay. You can't get away from it. Okay. And that's why we talked about the Parkinson pandemic all the way back in 2013. And it has just become a prophecy that we're not proud of, like watching it unfold. But here it is. It's in the communities. Every time I hire somebody, Polly, at Fixell, if you know me, I ask a couple of questions. One of those questions is, who in your family has Parkinson? The question isn't, is there, do you have Parkinson? It's who in your family, who in your close friend group, who in the people. And it usually leads to a robust discussion of people that they know within families, extended families. Why do I do that? Because it's deeply personal. The people that work here at Fixell, the people that work at Davis-Phinney, we are all touched by it. And it's getting more and more. It's growing. And we have the potential, as Ray has really, shown the world, we have the potential to move toward prevention. Let's pick up. Let's do it. Let's pick up and let's move toward prevention. Let's move toward learning why. We need to understand where Parkinson starts, how it progresses, what are the early inciting factors, that it's not one disease, and focus our therapies not at the very end where there are plaques kind of all over the brain. Okay. But at the beginning stages, what's happening? What are those first early things that we learn why on? Get our care plans shifted over to things like cancer, HIV, navigation types of plans, and take care of these 11, 12 million people that have Parkinson already and are growing, and then have a realistic path forward across early, what we need to do now, middle, 6 to 10 years later. Okay. Employ our Parkinson 25, the things that we can do to change even ourselves while we're changing society along the pathway, and work together and amplify and synergize our voices. And we can have levodopa for all, and we can get that incidence down of Parkinson's disease. These are achievable goals. We got to put them out there and go for them. And what we're saying is, let's go for it. Guys, it's time. Let's do this.
Let's do this. Where can our listeners get a copy of your book?
So if you go to pdplan.org, we have a nice website with blogs and all sorts of things. Or just go to pdplan.org.
And you can get it at your favorite bookseller. You can pre-order it on Amazon. You can get it if you are part of an organization. You want to do it for your support group. You can go to BookPal or Porchlight and buy heavily discounted copies. We're trying to get attention, because the more pre-orders, selfishly, the more pre-orders we get, the more attention we give. And Michael and I are going to devote a large portion of our proceeds to efforts to prevent and treat Parkinson's disease. And the more media attention we get on this, the more actions we can take on the policy front. We can start a virtuous cycle that will hopefully lead to the disappearance of Parkinson's disease as a major clinical entity. Just like polio has disappeared, just like HIV is disappearing before us, just like peptic ulcer disease. Lots of diseases have disappeared in our lifetimes, and we want Parkinson's disease to be the next one.
Ray, Michael, thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights, your expertise, your research, and most of all, your passion for creating a world free of Parkinson's. Until next time, we hope that you take care of one another take care of yourself and take care of the world we live in. Thank you for being a part of this work, Ray and Michael. Thank you for being here today.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Parkinson's Podcast. For more information about the Davis-Phinney Foundation and to learn about educational offerings and community events for people affected by Parkinson's, please visit davisphinneyfoundation.org or dpf.org. This content includes information, insights, and opinions from our Parkinson's community. The views expressed are those of individual participants and do not constitute medical advice. This content is not intended to substitute for the guidance, advice, or recommendations of your personal healthcare providers.